before passing away. Tony Curtis decided to reveal a shocking list, the 7 best lovers he ever possessed. He didn't speak of romantic affairs or promises. He spoke bluntly about instinct, conquest, and the wildest nights in Hollywood. The list includes a liberated Sharon Tate, who taught him the meaning of absolute freedom in the bedroom, a Janet Leigh with a perfect body, whom he considered the most precious and proud trophy of his life, and an arrogant Gina Lollobrigida, who gave him the ultimate thrill of conquering a queen. Today, we will hear this bad boy recount his bedroom exploits himself, a truth that is naked and unvarnished. Sharon Tate, the liberated angel and a fleeting romance. A September afternoon in 2009, at his villa in Henderson, Nevada. Tony Curtis sat in his wheelchair. He was 84 years old. His health had faded significantly. His breathing labored. Surrounding him were oil paintings he had painted himself and black and white photos of a golden era. He was giving an interview for a final memoir when the reporter asked about the women he had loved. Tony laughed. He asked the nurse to bring him a small glass of wine, then began to recount his tale in a voice full of nostalgia. Tony Curtis took a sip of wine. He looked out the window, where the desert sun was beating down. He began to speak of the first name on his list, Sharon Tate. It was 1967. Tony Curtis was 42. He was at the peak of his career, starring in a comedy called Don't Make Waves. The film was shot on Malibu Beach, California. It was a movie about surfing, the beach, and beautiful young girls. In the film, Tony played the male lead. Sharon Tate played a skydiver named Malibu. It was one of her first major roles. Sharon was only 24 at the time. Tony recalled the first time he saw Sharon on set. It was a very sunny day. Sharon walked out of the makeup trailer. She was wearing a tiny bikini. Her hair was golden, her skin a healthy tan. She walked barefoot on the hot sand. Every man on the crew stopped working to watch her. Tony was no exception. He admitted he was instantly captivated. He had never seen anyone with such natural and radiant beauty. Tony took the initiative to approach Sharon. He thought she would be reserved because he was a big star. But no, Sharon was very natural. She smiled brightly and shook his hand. She spoke comfortably, without any subservience or pretense. This surprised Tony. Other girls usually tried to impress him. Sharon did not. She was just herself. Their relationship began in the very first week of filming. Tony invited Sharon to dinner after work. They drove along the Pacific Coast Highway in Tony's convertible. The sea breeze messed up Sharon's hair, but she didn't bother fixing it. She laughed loud when Tony told jokes about Hollywood. They stopped at a quiet seafood restaurant. Over the meal, Sharon told Tony about her life. She talked about her love for travel, her hippie friends, and her philosophy of living freely. Tony realized Sharon was different. She didn't care about money or fame. She just wanted to have fun and experience life. After dinner, they went to the house Tony was renting nearby. It was a wooden house overlooking the ocean. That night, they slept together for the first time. Tony described Sharon in bed very simply. She was a magnificent lover. Sharon had no hesitation or feigned innocence. She was enthusiastic and proactive. For Sharon, sex was a natural joy, like eating or breathing. She didn't view it as an exchange or a binding contract. Sharon's liberation made Tony feel exhilarated. He felt rejuvenated when he was beside her. Throughout the filming of Don't Make Waves, they met frequently. Tony recounted that Sharon had a very strange habit. She didn't like wearing restrictive clothing. Inside Tony's house, she often walked around naturally wearing nothing at all, or just draped in a thin shirt. She made coffee, read books, and listened to music in that state. Tony loved watching her like that. He saw her as beautiful as a living statue. However, the relationship didn't last long. Tony knew it wouldn't. He was a man of the world, and Sharon was a free bird. He couldn't clip her wings. Moreover, At that time, Sharon was also beginning a relationship with director Roman Polanski. Tony knew this, but he wasn't jealous. He and Sharon made no promises to each other. They came together for the momentary joy. When the film wrapped, they parted ways very gently. No tears, no arguments. Sharon hugged Tony and thanked him for the fun times. Tony kissed her forehead and wished her luck. Then, they went their separate ways. 2 years later. In August 1969, Tony was in London when he heard the terrible news. Sharon Tate, now the wife of Roman Polanski and 8 months pregnant, had been brutally murdered in her own home by the Manson family. Upon hearing the news, Tony was in heavy shock. He couldn't believe it. He remembered the image of the young girl full of life on Malibu Beach that year. He remembered her laugh, remembered her warm skin. He felt a pang of grief. Someone as beautiful and harmless as Sharon did not deserve such a horrific death. Returning to reality in Nevada in 2009, Tony Curtis sighed. He set the wine glass down on the table. He told the reporter that, in his list of lovers, Sharon Tate held a special place, not because they loved each other the deepest, but because she gave him a sense of absolute freedom. Yvonne De Carlo, the teacher who taught him how to be a man. The sun had begun to set behind the Rocky Mountains of Nevada. Tony Curtis's room grew dim. The nurse entered and turned on the warm lights. Tony Curtis adjusted the blanket over his legs. He asked the nurse to fetch him an old poster of the movie Criss Cross. He held the image, squinting at the woman in the magnificent evening gown standing next to a young boy. Tony pointed at the boy and laughed. That was him before the fame, and the woman was Yvonne De Carlo. Tony said, "This was my first teacher." Tony Curtis began to tell the story of 1948. At that time, he wasn't yet the dashing Tony Curtis everyone knew. His real name was Bernie Schwartz. He was a poor kid from the Bronx, New York. He was only 23, had just signed a contract with Universal Studios, and was a nobody. He was very self-conscious about his background. He dressed tackily and spoke clumsily. In contrast, Yvonne De Carlo was already a massive star. People called her the Queen of Technicolor. She was beautiful, luxurious, and very powerful. Wherever she went, people served her. Tony received a small role in Criss Cross. His role had no important lines. His task was simply to play a guy dancing with Yvonne on the dance floor in one scene. Tony was very nervous. He was afraid he would mess up and get fired. On the day of shooting that scene, Tony stood in the corner of the set. He watched Yvonne walk out. She was wearing a tight dress, heavily made up. She glanced over the crowd of extras and stopped her eyes on Tony. Tony looked down in shyness. The director yelled, "Action!" Tony stepped onto the dance floor with Yvonne. The music started. Tony froze. He didn't know where to put his hands properly. He was afraid of stepping on the star's feet. He danced like a robot. Yvonne realized the awkwardness. She didn't scold Tony. She didn't complain to the director. Instead, she squeezed Tony's hand tight. She pulled him closer. She whispered in his ear, "Relax, kid. Just follow me." That sentence saved Tony. He began to move to Yvonne's rhythm. The scene was completed beautifully. Tony breathed a sigh of relief. He intended to go back to his spot when Yvonne called him over. She looked straight into his eyes and asked, "What are you doing tonight?" Tony stammered. He said he had no plans. Yvonne smiled. She wrote an address on a small slip of paper, tucked it into Tony's breast pocket, and said, "Come to my place at 8. Don't be late." That night, Tony went to Yvonne's private home. It was a beautiful villa in Beverly Hills. Tony had never stepped into such a luxurious house. He felt small and out of place. Yvonne opened the door. She was wearing a thin silk robe. She invited Tony in and poured him a drink. Tony sat motionless on the sofa, feeling his limbs were superfluous. Yvonne sat down next to him. She didn't beat around the bush. She asked about Tony's life, about his family in the Bronx. She listened very attentively. That night, Tony stayed at Yvonne's house. Tony recounted that Yvonne De Carlo was not just a lover, she was truly a teacher. In the bedroom, Yvonne was the one in control. She had experience and knew what she wanted. She taught Tony how to please a woman. She taught him patience and subtlety. Before that, Tony was just a hasty and rough young boy. Thanks to Yvonne, he began to understand the art of the boudoir. But Yvonne taught Tony more than that. In the days that followed, they dated secretly. Yvonne critiqued Tony's style of dress. She told him to throw away the cheap, baggy clothes. She showed him how to choose a suit, how to tie a tie to look elegant. She taught him how to walk, how to look into the eyes of the person opposite him when speaking. "You're handsome," Yvonne often said, "but you need to believe you're handsome so others can believe it." The relationship lasted a few months. It was more like a crash course than a romance. Yvonne De Carlo liked young boys, but she also got bored easily. As Tony began to grow more confident and get more roles, Yvonne gradually grew distant. Tony remembered the last time they met privately. Yvonne told him very frankly, "You've graduated, Bernie. Now go out there and become Tony Curtis." They parted on good terms. No arguments or clinging. Tony left Yvonne's house with a completely different mindset. He was no longer the timid Bernie Schwartz. He had the demeanor of a star. Janet Leigh, the most perfect trophy in the collection. Tony Curtis asked the nurse for a fresh glass of wine. He felt his throat going a bit dry. He told the reporter to grab the thick, leather-bound album lying on the bookshelf. He turned the pages slowly. He stopped at a page pasted full of newspaper clippings from the 50s. The headline read in bold, "Hollywood's Fairy Tale Wedding." In the photo, Tony and Janet Leigh were cutting a wedding cake, both smiling radiantly. Tony touched his finger to Janet's smile. He said, "This was my peak. Possessing her was like planting my flag on the summit of Everest." Tony Curtis began to tell the story of 1950. By this time, he had started to become famous. He had completely shed the name of the rustic Bernie Schwartz. He was Tony Curtis, the rising star. But he still felt he lacked something to be truly recognized by Hollywood. He needed a woman of worthy status, a queen. And he met Janet Leigh. They met at an RKO party. Janet was already an A-list star then. She was beautiful, classy, and had a very clean private life. She was the ideal model for every American boy. Tony saw her standing in the corner of the room, holding a glass of champagne. He decided right then and there he had to have her. Tony didn't approach Janet the way he approached other girls. He wasn't aggressive. He used his charm and humor to attract her. Janet was a proper girl. She liked polite gentlemen. Tony played that role perfectly. They married in 1951. Their wedding was the biggest event of the year. Thousands of fans stood packed outside the hotel to cheer. Tony recalled the feeling at that moment. He held Janet's hand and stepped out onto the balcony to greet the crowd. He didn't just feel happy. He felt victorious. He, a poor kid from the Bronx slums, was now holding the hand of Hollywood's princess. Janet Leigh was the most prestigious gold trophy he had won. Their married life was initially wonderful. They were the golden couple. Magazines fought to photograph them. Directors invited them to star in movies together. They had money, fame, and each other. Tony spoke about his sex life with Janet frankly. He said Janet was a perfect wife, both in the kitchen and in bed. She had a flawless body. She was very accommodating to her husband. She always wanted to please Tony. However, Tony began to realize the problem after a few years of living together. Janet was too perfect. She was too organized and regimented. Janet ran the house like a military barracks. Everything had to be in its place. Breakfast had to be on time. Clothes had to be ironed flat, even intimacy. Janet wanted it to take place in a clean, fragrant space, and according to a schedule. Tony was a man with a wild nature. He liked spontaneity. He liked a bit of mess, a bit of grit, but Janet did not. She always worried about maintaining their image. She feared scandal. Cracks began to appear slowly. Tony felt suffocated in his wife's perfection. He started drinking more. He began to feel jealous of Janet's career, especially after she starred in Psycho and became a global phenomenon. In 1962, Tony decided to end the marriage. He met Christine Kaufmann, a 17-year-old girl on the set of Terrace Bulba. Christine was young, innocent, and looked at Tony like a god. That defeated Tony. He went home and told Janet he wanted a divorce. The breakup happened quickly. Janet was shocked. She didn't understand what she had done wrong. She had done everything perfectly. But that was exactly the problem. Tony didn't need perfection anymore. Tony left their lavish mansion with only a few suitcases of clothes. He left Janet and their 2 daughters. He admitted he was very cruel at that time, but he also felt relieved. He had escaped the role of the perfect husband he had been forced to play for 11 years, returning to the present in Nevada. Tony Curtis closed the album. He pushed it away. He told the reporter that he didn't regret the marriage to Janet Leigh, thanks to her. He had climbed to the peak of society. She had given him 2 talented daughters, Jamie Lee and Kelly. Tony Curtis closed his eyes. He seemed tired after recounting this longest chapter of his life. He signaled he wanted to rest a bit before moving to the next chapter about a woman with a personality completely opposite to Janet Leigh. A person who was a carbon copy of himself, Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood, sleeping with a carbon copy of himself. Tony Curtis began to talk about 1964 by this time. Tony was divorced from Janet Leigh. He was enjoying the bachelor life. He joined the film Sex and the Single Girl alongside Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood was a superstar at the time. She had been famous since childhood with Miracle on 34th Street and later West Side Story. She was splendidly beautiful, dark brown hair, big round black-brown eyes, olive skin. Tony immediately realized the similarity between the 2 of them. Both were children of poor immigrants. Both had to fight to survive in Hollywood from a very young age. And most importantly, both had very similar physical appearances. Tony recounted that the first time they stood next to each other in front of the mirror in the makeup room, both were stunned. They looked like twins. The same smile, the same eyes craving attention. Their relationship began on the set of The Great Race in 1965. This was a massive action comedy with a huge budget. Tony and Natalie played rivals and also lovers. Tony admitted he loved Natalie because he loved himself. It was a form of narcissistic love. When Tony held Natalie, he felt like he was embracing his own ego. He liked the way she looked at him. Her eyes reflected the admiration he always craved. In bed, their relationship was intense but also full of competition. Tony described it as a duel. Who was more beautiful? Who was sexier? Who controlled the game? Both wanted to be the brightest star, even in the darkness of the bedroom. Natalie was a complex woman. She was very vulnerable. She constantly worried about her looks and her position in Hollywood. She was afraid of getting old, afraid of being forgotten by the audience. Tony understood that fear well. He had the exact same fear. So, they found empathy in each other. The nights they spent together were often full of chaotic emotions. Sometimes they laughed like 2 children. Sometimes they sat silently drinking, complaining about the pressures of acting. Tony said Natalie loved to be complimented. He had to constantly tell her she was the most beautiful, the most talented. And in return, Natalie also stroked Tony's ego with high praise. However, that very similarity killed the relationship. Tony told of a memory on the set of The Great Race. It was the giant pie-throwing scene. Thousands of cream pies were used. Both Tony and Natalie were covered in cream from head to toe. At first, both laughed. But then, Natalie started to get annoyed. She hated being dirty. She hated that her perfect makeup was ruined. She started screaming at the crew members. Tony saw that image and was startled. He saw his own selfishness and diva behavior in Natalie. Two big stars couldn't coexist in a narrow sky. They started arguing. They fought over screen time. They scrutinized which camera angles honored whom more. Professional rivalry had crept into the romantic relationship. Tony realized that being with Natalie was exhausting. He needed a woman who worshipped him, who was a background for him, not a woman who always wanted to fight for the spotlight with him. Natalie was the same. She needed a man to protect her, not a man who was also fickle and needed pampering like Tony. And so they parted amicably right after the movie ended. In 1981, when he heard the news that Natalie Wood had mysteriously drowned during a boat trip with her husband, Robert Wagner. Tony was very sad, but his sadness was different from when he heard about Sharon Tate. With Sharon, he felt regret for a flower plucked too soon, but with Natalie, he felt like a part of himself had died. He understood the loneliness and despair that Natalie might have felt in those final moments in the cold sea. Mamie Van Doren, The Speeding Race Car, and Raw Lust. The next name made Tony Curtis sit up straight in his wheelchair. He winked at the reporter, his smile gradually becoming mischievous. He pointed to a model of a red Jaguar race car on the desk. He said, "You see this car, it's loud, it guzzles gas, and it's very dangerous. But when you drive it, you feel alive." Mamie Van Doren was that car. Tony Curtis turned back time to the mid-50s. At that time, Hollywood was crazy for blonde. Busty boss, bombshells, Marilyn Monroe was number 1, Jane Mansfield was number 2, and Mamie Van Doren was number 3. Universal called her their answer to Marilyn Monroe. But Tony said Mamie was completely different from the other two. Marilyn was fragile, breakable. Jane tried to act dumb. But Mamie, she was dynamite. She was a genuine bad girl. She liked racing cars, liked rock and roll, and liked men. Tony met Mamie at the Universal Studios commissary. That day, Mamie was wearing a sweater so tight, Tony thought it was about to rip. She wore sharp high heels, walking provocatively. She wasn't shy like Janet Leigh. She looked straight at Tony and laughed loud. Her laughter echoed through the dining room. Their relationship started not with romantic flirtations. It started with a car race. Both Tony and Mamie loved speed. Tony had an expensive sports car. Mamie also had a white Jaguar. One night, they met on Mulholland Drive, the winding pass road, famous for being dangerous in Los Angeles. They raced in the middle of the night. The sound of engines roaring tore through the quiet night. Mamie drove insanely. She wasn't afraid to die. She cackled every time she took a sharp turn. Tony had to try his best to catch up to her. When they reached the top of the hill, they stopped the cars. The smell of burning rubber was pungent. The smell of gasoline was heavy. Both were extremely excited from the adrenaline. They threw themselves at each other right on the hood of the hot car. Tony described the sex with Mamie in very direct terms. It was a physical battle. No scented candles, no soft music, no cheesy words of love. Mamie didn't need those things. She wanted action. She wanted roughness. With Janet Leigh, Tony had to play a gentle gentleman. With Natalie Wood, he had to play a psychological lover. But with Mamie Van Doren, he just needed to be a male animal. He was allowed to be rude, allowed to be selfish. Mamie liked that. She responded with terrifying enthusiasm. Tony recounted that Mamie had a beautiful, toned, and flexible body. She never lay still. She was proactive and demanding. Nights with Mamie were like participating in a wrestling match. The next morning, Tony often woke up with scratches on his back and an aching body, but his spirit was extremely refreshed. They partied all night often. They went to the loudest nightclubs on the Sunset Strip. They drank, danced, and caused a scene. The press called them the wild couple. Tony liked that feeling, After years of playing the model husband with Janet Leigh, Mamie was the perfect antidote. She helped him release all his repressed frustrations. However, Tony also admitted that the relationship was very shallow. They never talked seriously with each other. Tony didn't know what Mamie thought about life. Mamie didn't care what Tony was worried about. They just met to have fun, to satisfy lust and speed. Tony remembered one time. He tried to talk to Mamie about a difficult role he was taking. He wanted to find some shared understanding. But Mamie just yawned. She said, "Come on, Tony, don't ruin the mood. Acting is just a job. Have another drink and let's go racing." That sentence woke Tony up. Mamie was a great party, but no one can party forever. He started to feel tired. Mamie's noise started to give him a headache. Her wildness began to become meaningless. Moreover, Tony realized Mamie wasn't a woman reserved just for him. She was a moth. She was attracted to whatever light was brightest. She also dallied with many other men. Tony, although a bad boy, also had high self-esteem and possessiveness. He didn't want to share his race car with others. They broke up after a petty argument. No suffering or clinging. It was like walking out of a bar after a drunken night. You feel happy, but you know it's time to go home and sleep. Tony Curtis looked back at the race car model on the table. He smiled slightly, his face holding a bit of nostalgia, but absolutely no regret. Gina Lollobrigida, the battle to subdue the Italian queen. Tony Curtis continued to take us to Paris in 1956. At this time, Tony was participating in the blockbuster movie Trapeze. This was a big opportunity for him to prove he was a serious actor, not just a handsome face. His co-star was Gina Lollobrigida, the sex symbol of Italian cinema. At that time, Gina was the hottest name in Europe. People called her Lollo. She had a fiery beauty, sharp eyes, and an hourglass figure that drove men crazy. But she was also famous for being arrogant. The first time they met on the set in Paris, Gina showed attitude immediately. She looked Tony up and down and spoke a stream of Italian to her assistant. Tony didn't understand, but he knew it wasn't a compliment. Gina looked down on Hollywood actors. She thought Tony was just a talentless, pretty boy sent there to look good. Tony Curtis, a Bronx boy full of pride, was stung. He determined to conquer this haughty bombshell, not just to satisfy his lust, but to assert his position. "I will make her look at me with different eyes," Tony told himself. The conquest took place right during the intense filming process. They played two trapeze artists who loved each other, but were also full of conflict. Tony took advantage of the intimate scenes to flirt with Gina. Tony recounted that Gina was very high maintenance. She always demanded everything revolve around her. She wanted the best camera angles, the best lighting. She was frequently late and made the whole crew wait. However, Tony was a master of the game of love. He didn't pamper Gina like other men. He used the hot and cold tactic. Sometimes he praised her beauty to the skies. Other times he acted cold, ignoring her to go talk to the French girls on the crew. Tony's calculated indifference provoked Gina. She was used to men catering to her. The fact that Tony didn't kneel at her feet annoyed her and made her curious. One night, after filming a kissing scene on the trapeze, Gina took the initiative to invite Tony to her hotel room to rehearse lines. And naturally, they didn't just rehearse lines. Tony described Gina in bed as truly Italian, passionate, loud, and full of drama. She had terrible energy, but even in the most private moments, Gina still wanted to be the commander. She wanted Tony to submit to her. But Tony wasn't a novice. He knew how to turn the tables. He turned the lovemaking into a battle of wits. Who was in charge? Who made the other beg? Tony said sleeping with Gina was exhausting, not because of physical effort, but because he had to strain his brain to deal with her massive ego. The relationship, or rather the one-night stand that lasted a few weeks of filming, was like a Cold War. By day, They glared at each other, fighting for the frame on set. By night, they threw themselves at each other to relieve tension and to prove power. When the movie wrapped, Tony felt relieved. He had gotten Gina, had written her name on his list of achievements, but he had absolutely no intention of maintaining the relationship. Tony remembered the day they parted at Orly Airport. Gina looked at him, adjusted her sunglasses, and said, "You act all right, Tony, but don't dream that I'll miss you." Tony smiled back, "Me neither. Gina, goodbye." Mentioning Gina made him remember the noise and tension of Paris that year. Now, he wanted to end the list with a softer low note. A young woman who came to him when he began to feel old age crashing down Christine Kaufmann. Christine Kaufmann, the Lolita who saved his old age. It was late in Henderson, Nevada. Tony Curtis seemed weary. He leaned fully back into his wheelchair. His eyes were half closed. But when the reporter mentioned the name Christine Kaufmann, he opened his eyes immediately. He didn't smile. His face held a fleeting sadness. He pointed to a small oil painting hanging in a dark corner of the room. It was a portrait of a girl with big round eyes, innocent as an angel. Tony Curtis brought the story back to 1962. At this time, Tony was 37, for a male actor in Hollywood. This is a dangerous age. He began to see crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. He began to worry about the younger generation of actors replacing him. At home, the marriage to Janet Leigh had turned cold. Everything was too orderly, too perfect, and too boring. Tony felt like an old man trapped in a golden cage. He craved a new vibration, something to help him feel he was still young and attractive. And he found that in Argentina, on the set of the epic film Taras Bulba. That was where he met Christine Kaufmann. She was a German actress, and the most important thing, she was only 17 years old. Tony recalled the first moment he saw Christine. She was wearing traditional costumes in the movie, standing in the sun-scorched grass fields of Argentina. She was purely beautiful. She didn't have the sharpness of Gina Lollobrigida, didn't have the wildness of Mamie Van Doren. Christine was like a blank sheet of paper. The age gap between them was 20 years. Tony was a world-famous star, while Christine was just an adolescent girl bewildered by the glamour of cinema. Tony began to approach Christine. He played the role of a senior, a mentor. He showed her how to act, how to walk. Christine looked at Tony with worshiping eyes. She listened to every word he said as if swallowing drops of honey. Those worshiping eyes defeated Tony. With Janet Leigh, Tony was a husband, a father, an equal partner, and frequently reminded of responsibilities. But with Christine, Tony was a god. He felt powerful. He felt rejuvenated. Christine's innocence was a mirror reflecting the image of a great Tony Curtis that he always wanted to see. They fell in love right on the set of Taras Bulba. The desolate setting of Argentina helped them escape the scrutiny of the press. Tony recounted that the nights with Christine, he didn't feel naked lust like with previous lovers. He felt a sense of cherishing. He wanted to protect this little girl. And in return, Christine's youth transferred to him, making him forget he was a middle-aged man with a family. When the film ended, Tony had to face reality. He returned to the U.S. to Janet Leigh and the perfect house in Beverly Hills. But he couldn't stand it anymore. The image of Christine haunted him. He compared Janet's age and rules with Christine's freshness and freedom. Finally, Tony made a decision that shocked Hollywood. He divorced Janet Leigh to marry the 17-year-old Christine Kaufmann. Public opinion attacked Tony fiercely at the time. They called him a traitor, a philandering man abandoning his wife and children to chase a young lover. But Tony didn't care. He said, "They don't understand. Christine isn't just sex. She is my second youth." Tony and Christine married in 1963. Christine bore him 2 more daughters. However, every drug eventually loses its effect. The marriage only lasted 5 years. Tony admitted his mistake. He loved Christine's innocence at age 17, but everyone has to grow up. Christine gradually matured. She was no longer the little girl worshiping Tony like the first days. She began to have her own opinions, her own desires. She wanted to return to Europe, wanted a career. Tony still wanted to keep her in the glass cage of that innocence. He wanted her to forever be his little muse. When Christine changed, Tony felt disappointed. He realized he had traded a warm family to chase an illusion. He loved her youth, but he wasn't sure he loved her true self when she matured. They divorced in 1968. Christine took the 2 children back to Germany. Tony stayed in Hollywood, continuing other romantic adventures. But no one left as deep an impression as that German Lolita. Tony Curtis has departed, taking his final bedroom secrets to the grave. He lived a life millions of men crave. This list of 7 women is his legacy, brilliant, frivolous, and full of carnality. He didn't need forgiveness. He only needed to be remembered as a legendary bad boy who conquered all of Hollywood. Which of Tony Curtis's lovers' stories impressed you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to click subscribe to continue discovering the next secret files. The most naked corners of Hollywood are still waiting to be flipped open.